Hans-My-Hedgehog. Once there was a farmer who had all the money and land he wanted, but despite his wealth, there was one thing missing from his life. He and his wife had never had any children. When he met other farmers in town or at the market, they would often make fun of him and ask why he and his wife had never managed to do what their cattle did regularly. Didn't they know how to do it? In the end he lost his temper, and when he got back home he swore and said, "I will have a child, even if it's a hedgehog." Not long afterwards his wife did have a child, a boy, as they could see from his bottom half. The top half, though, was a hedgehog. When she saw him, she was horrified. "See what you've done," she cried. "This is all your fault." "It can't be helped," said the farmer. "We're stuck with him. He'll have to be baptized like a normal boy, but I don't know who we can ask to be godfather." "And the only name we can give him," she said, "is Hans-My-Hedgehog." When he was baptized, the priest said, "I don't know what you'll do for a bed. He can't sleep on a normal mattress. He'd jab holes all over it." The farmer and his wife saw the truth of that and put some straw down behind the stove and laid him there. His mother couldn't suckle him. She tried, but it was too painful altogether. The little creature lay behind the stove for 8 years, and his father grew sick to death of him. "I wish he'd kick the bucket," he thought, but Hans-My-Hedgehog didn't die. He just lay there. One day there happened to be a fair in the town, and the farmer wanted to go. He asked his wife what she'd like him to bring back for her. "A bit of steak and 6 rolls," she said. Then he asked the maidservant, and she asked for a pair of slippers and some fancy stockings. Finally he said to his son, "Well, what would you like?" "Papa," said Hans-My-Hedgehog, "I'd like some bagpipes." When the father came back, he gave his wife the steak and the rolls. He gave the maid the slippers and stockings. And finally, he went behind the stove and gave Hans-My-Hedgehog his bagpipes. Then Hans-My-Hedgehog said, "Papa, go to the blacksmith's and have him make some shoes for the cockerel. Once you've done that, I'll ride away and never come back." The farmer was happy to get rid of him, so he took the cockerel to the blacksmith's and had him shod. Once that was done, Hans-My-Hedgehog jumped on the cockerel's back and rode away, taking some pigs with him to tend in the forest. Once they were in the forest, he spurred the cockerel up, and it flew high into a tree with him. There he sat, keeping an eye on his pigs and learning how to play the bagpipes. Years went by, and his father had no idea where he was. But the herd grew bigger and bigger, and he played more and more skillfully. In fact, the music he made was quite beautiful. One day a king came riding past. He had lost his way in the forest, and he was amazed to hear such lovely music, so he stopped to listen to it. He had no idea where it was coming from, so he sent a servant to find the musician. The servant looked around and finally came back to the king. "There's a strange little animal sitting up in that tree, Your Majesty," he said. "It looks to be a cockerel with a hedgehog sitting on it, and the hedgehog's playing the bagpipes." "Well, go and ask it the way," said the king. The servant went and called up into the tree, and Hans-My-Hedgehog stopped playing and climbed down to the ground. He bowed to the king and said, "What can I do for you, Your Majesty?" "You can tell me the way to my kingdom. I'm lost." "With pleasure, Your Majesty. I'll tell you the way if you promise in writing to give me the first thing that greets you when you arrive home." The king looked at him and thought, "That's easy enough to promise. This monster won't be able to read, so I can write anything." So he took pen and ink and wrote a few words on a piece of paper. Hans-My-Hedgehog took it and showed him the way, and the king set off and was soon home again. Now, the king had a daughter, and when she saw him coming back, she was overjoyed and ran down to greet him and kiss him. She was the first person he met on the way in, and of course the king thought about Hans-My-Hedgehog and told his daughter how he had nearly had to promise her to a strange animal that sat on a cockerel and played the bagpipes. "But don't you worry, my dear," he said. "I wrote something quite different. That hedgehog creature won't be able to read."
"That's a good thing, because I wouldn't have gone with him anyway," said the princess.
Meanwhile, Hans-My-Hedgehog stayed in the forest enjoying himself, tending his pigs and playing his bagpipes. The forest happened to be very large, and not long afterwards another king came by with all his servants and messengers, and he too was lost. Like the first king, he heard the beautiful music and sent a messenger to find out where it was coming from. The messenger saw Hans-My-Hedgehog up in the tree playing the bagpipes and called up to ask what he was doing.
"I am keeping an eye on my pigs," Hans-My-Hedgehog called down. "What do you want?"
The messenger explained, and Hans-My-Hedgehog came down and told the old king he'd tell him the way in exchange for a promise. And it was the same promise as before. The king must give him the first creature that greeted him when he got home. The king agreed and signed a paper saying so. Once that was done, Hans-My-Hedgehog rode ahead on the cockerel to show them the way to the edge of the forest, where he said goodbye to the king and went back to his pigs. And so the king came home safely, to the joy of all his courtiers. This king, too, had an only daughter, who was very beautiful, and she was the first to run out and welcome her beloved father. She threw her arms around him and kissed him, and asked him where he'd been and why he'd taken so long.
"We lost our way, my love," he said, "but in the depths of the forest we came upon the strangest thing, a half-hedgehog, half-boy, sitting on a cockerel and playing the bagpipes, playing them remarkably well, too. He showed us the way, you see, and, well, my dear, I had to promise to give him whoever came out to greet me first. Oh, my darling, I'm so terribly sorry."
But the princess loved her father, and she said she wouldn't make him break his promise. She would go with Hans-My-Hedgehog whenever he came for her. Meanwhile, back in the forest, Hans-My-Hedgehog looked after his pigs. And those pigs had more pigs, and then those pigs had more pigs, until there were so many that the forest was full of pigs from one end to the other. At that point, Hans-My-Hedgehog decided that he'd spent all the time he wanted to in the forest. He sent a message to his father, saying that they should empty all the pigsties in the village, because he was coming with such a large herd of pigs that anyone who wanted some pork or bacon could join in and help themselves. His father was a bit put out to hear this. He thought Hans-My-Hedgehog was dead and gone. But then along came his son, driving all those pigs in front of him, and the village had such a slaughter that they could hear the noise 2 miles away. When it was all over, Hans-My-Hedgehog said, "Papa, my cockerel needs new shoes. If you take him to the blacksmith and have him shod again, I'll ride away and never come back as long as I live." So the farmer did that, and was relieved to think that he'd seen the back of Hans-My-Hedgehog at last. When the cockerel was ready, Hans-My-Hedgehog jumped on his back and rode away. He rode and rode until he came to the kingdom of the first king, the king of the broken promise. The king had given strict orders that if anyone approached the palace playing the bagpipes and riding on a cockerel, they should be shot, stabbed, bombed, knocked out, blown up, strangled, anything to prevent them from entering. So when Hans-My-Hedgehog appeared, the guards were ordered to charge at him with their bayonets. But he was too quick for them. He spurred the cockerel up into the air and flew right over the top of the soldiers, over the palace wall and up to the king's window. He perched there on the sill and shouted out that he'd come for what he'd been promised, and that if the king tried to weasel out of it, he'd pay for it with his life, and so would the princess. The king told his daughter that she better do what Hans-My-Hedgehog wanted. She put on a white dress, and the king hastily ordered a carriage with 6 fine horses to be made ready, and piled gold and silver and the deeds to several fine farms and forests into it, and ordered 24 of his best servants to go with it. The horses were harnessed, the servants were all lined up, the princess climbed in, and then Hans-My-Hedgehog took his place beside her with the cockerel on his knee and the bagpipes in his lap. They said goodbye and off they went. The king thought he'd never see his daughter again. He was wrong about that, though. As soon as they were out of the city, Hans-My-Hedgehog ordered the princess out of the carriage and told the servants to take several paces backward and look the other way. Then he tore the princess's white dress into shreds and stuck her all over with his prickles until she was covered in blood. "That's what you get for trying to deceive me," he said. "Now, clear off. Go home. You're no good to me, and I don't want you." And she went home with the servants and the gold and the carriage and all, disgraced. So much for her. As for Hans-My-Hedgehog, he took his bagpipes and jumped on the cockerel and rode away to the second kingdom, whose king had behaved very differently from the first one. He had given orders that if anyone arrived in the kingdom looking like a hedgehog and riding a cockerel, he should be saluted, given a cavalry escort, greeted with crowds and cheering and waving flags, and brought with honour to the royal palace. The king had told his daughter what Hans-My-Hedgehog looked like, of course, but when she saw him, she was shocked all the same. However, there was nothing to be done about it. Her father had given his word, and she had given hers. She bade Hans-My-Hedgehog welcome with all her heart, and they were married at once, and sat next to each other at the banquet. And then it was time to go to bed. He could see she was afraid of his prickles. "You mustn't be frightened," he said. "I'd do anything rather than hurt you." He told the old king to have a large fire made in the fireplace on the landing, and to have 4 men ready outside the bedroom door. "I'm going to take off my hedgehog skin as soon as I go into the bedroom," he explained. "The men must seize it at once and throw it on the fire, and stay there till it's burnt all to ash." When the clock struck 11, Hans-My-Hedgehog went into the bedroom, took off his skin, and laid it down by the bed. Immediately the 4 men rushed in, seized the prickly skin, flung it on the fire, and stood around watching till it had all burned up. And the moment the last prickle was consumed by the last flame, Hans was free. He lay down on the bed like a human being at last. However, he was scorched and charred all over, as if he himself had been in the fire. The king sent at once for the royal physician, who cleaned him up and tended to his skin with special balms and ointments, and soon he looked like an ordinary young man, though much more handsome than most. The princess was overjoyed. The next morning they both rose from the royal bedchamber full of happiness, and when they had eaten breakfast, they celebrated their wedding again. And in time, Hans-My-Hedgehog succeeded the old king and inherited the kingdom. Some years later, he took his wife all the way back to see his father. Of course, the old farmer had no idea who he was. "I'm your son," said Hans-My-Hedgehog. "Oh, no, that can't be right," said the farmer.
I did have a son, but he was like a hedgehog, all covered in prickles, and he went off to see the world a long time ago."
But Hans said that he was the one, and told so many details about his life that the farmer was finally convinced, and the old man wept for joy and returned with his son to his kingdom. The end.